While Donald Trump was publicly threatening sweeping tariffs on Canada, U.S. manufacturers began receiving alerts they did not expect. Parts were not arriving on schedule. Shipments were not canceled, but delivery windows slipped just enough to disrupt production lines built around just-in-time inventory. This mattered because modern North American manufacturing runs on precision. A delay of days can idle an entire plant. That is not rhetoric. That is how the system is designed. Stay with this because once you see how integrated these supply chains actually are, the stakes look very different. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, the Trump administration signaled plans for broad tariffs and export leverage against Canada as part of a push for preferential access to critical materials and industrial inputs. These signals represented a significant shift in the bilateral trade relationship between the two countries, raising questions about the stability of North American supply chains and the future interpretation of existing trade agreements. Canada did not announce immediate retaliatory tariffs in response to these threats. Instead, Canadian officials emphasized existing trade rules under the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and signaled they would not accept demands that forced below-market pricing or unilateral concessions. This measured response reflected Canada's strategic approach to the dispute, prioritizing diplomatic channels and established legal frameworks rather than escalating the situation through reciprocal trade barriers. Canadian trade representatives made clear that while they remained open to dialogue, any renegotiation would need to respect the principles of fair trade and mutual benefit that underpin the current agreement. At the same time, U.S. manufacturers and trade groups warned that even short-term uncertainty at the U.S.-Canada border could disrupt auto, energy, and construction supply chains that have been carefully optimized over decades. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and multiple industry associations publicly cautioned that tariff threats alone were enough to delay shipments, trigger contract penalties, and idle facilities. These warnings highlighted the deeply integrated nature of North American manufacturing, where components often cross the border multiple times during production processes. The automotive sector proved particularly vulnerable, with just-in-time inventory systems leaving little room for disruption or delay. None of this required a formal embargo or the actual implementation of tariffs to create real economic consequences. As logistics experts told Politico, uncertainty itself changes behavior in tightly coupled systems. Companies facing potential tariffs began preemptively adjusting their operations, stockpiling certain materials, seeking alternative suppliers, and in some cases postponing investment decisions entirely. This phenomenon, sometimes called the chilling effect of trade policy uncertainty, can produce measurable economic impacts even when threatened measures never materialize. Financial markets also responded to the uncertainty, with volatility in sectors most exposed to cross-border trade. The situation illustrated how modern trade relationships operate not just through formal policy mechanisms but through the expectations and risk calculations of countless private actors. When those expectations shift, supply chains that depend on predictability and trust can experience disruption regardless of whether policy changes are ultimately enacted. If you have seen trade disputes play out differently in the past, share that perspective in the comments. Why this crossed a line? Trade experts interviewed by Reuters and The Washington Post noted that the red line was not tariffs alone. It was the implication that a sovereign trading partner should accept below-market terms under political pressure. This distinction proved crucial to understanding why the situation generated such strong reactions from trade policy professionals across the political spectrum. That crosses a basic norm of modern trade law. Governments can negotiate, impose tariffs, or seek dispute resolution through established channels like the World Trade Organization or bilateral agreement mechanisms. What they cannot reasonably expect is for another country to subsidize foreign industries by surrendering value without reciprocal benefit. This principle has underpinned international trade relationships since the post-World War II era, when nations sought to create predictable frameworks that would prevent the kind of economic nationalism that contributed to global conflict. The demand for preferential pricing on critical materials and industrial inputs essentially asked Canada to accept terms that would benefit U.S. manufacturers at the direct expense of Canadian producers and the Canadian economy. Such an arrangement would represent a form of economic coercion rather than negotiation between equals. Trade law recognizes that countries have different comparative advantages and resource endowments, but it presumes that transactions occur at market rates determined by supply, demand, and competitive forces rather than political pressure. Former U.S. trade officials told CNN that such demands undermine the trust that makes integrated supply chains possible in the first place. These officials, many with decades of experience negotiating trade agreements under both Republican and Democratic administrations, emphasized that cross-border supply chains depend on confidence that rules will be applied consistently and that agreements will be honored. When one party suggests it may use its market power or political leverage to extract concessions that violate the spirit of reciprocal trade, it creates uncertainty that extends far beyond the immediate dispute. This erosion of trust carries long-term consequences. Companies make investment decisions based on their expectations about future trade policy stability. Manufacturing facilities, supplier relationships, and logistics networks represent commitments that can take years to establish and cannot easily be relocated. When the fundamental premise of equal treatment under trade law comes into question, businesses face impossible planning challenges. They cannot efficiently allocate capital when the rules governing trade might shift based on political pressure rather than established legal frameworks. Several trade law scholars pointed out that the situation also set a concerning precedent for relationships with other trading partners. If the United States appeared willing to pressure Canada, its closest ally and most integrated trading partner, into accepting unfavorable terms, what signal did that send to other countries about American reliability as a trade partner? If you believe rules and standards matter regardless of politics, tap like. The pattern of tariff threats and economic reality. This was not the first time tariff threats created economic shock without producing durable gains. A review of recent trade policy initiatives reveals a consistent pattern where aggressive tariff measures generated immediate economic disruption, failed to achieve their stated objectives, and ultimately required costly interventions or policy reversals. China tariffs. As documented by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and reported by Reuters, retaliatory tariffs led to farm bailouts costing taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. When the United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, China responded by targeting American agricultural exports, particularly soybeans, pork, and other commodities. American farmers who had spent decades building relationships with Chinese buyers and developing supply chains tailored to that market, found themselves suddenly shut out. The resulting collapse in agricultural exports devastated farm income across the Midwest. The federal government responded with emergency relief payments that eventually exceeded $28 billion, effectively transferring the cost of the trade war from general tariff revenue to direct taxpayer subsidies. Despite these massive expenditures, many farmers never fully recovered their Chinese market share, as Brazilian and other competitors filled the gap. Mexico border threats. Automakers warned of near-immediate shutdowns before the policy was softened under industry pressure, according to Bloomberg. The automotive industry, which relies on components crossing the U.S.-Mexico border multiple times during manufacturing processes, responded with alarm to proposed border tariffs. Major manufacturers including General Motors, Ford, and Toyota publicly stated that even brief disruptions would force plant closures and layoffs within days, not weeks. The just-in-time inventory systems that make modern auto manufacturing efficient left no buffer for border delays or tariff-related cost increases. Industry executives warned that the threatened measures would eliminate any competitive advantage U.S. automakers had against foreign rivals. Facing the prospect of shuttering American plants and massive job losses in politically sensitive states, the administration backed away from the most severe proposals. Steel and aluminum tariffs. Studies cited by the Federal Reserve showed higher input costs for U.S. manufacturers without sustained job growth. While these tariffs were intended to protect American steel and aluminum producers, the economic analysis revealed a more complex picture. For every job potentially saved in primary metal production, multiple jobs in manufacturing sectors that use steel and aluminum as inputs faced increased costs. Construction companies, appliance manufacturers, and countless other industries absorbed higher material costs that they either passed on to consumers or absorbed through reduced margins. The Federal Reserve's research found no significant overall employment gains from the policy, while confirming measurable price increases for downstream users. Each case followed the same pattern: aggressive leverage, rapid market reaction, and eventual retreat under economic pressure. The cycle begins with bold tariff announcements meant to demonstrate resolve and create negotiating pressure. Markets and industries respond immediately, often more severely than policymakers anticipate. Supply chains prove more fragile, business relationships more difficult to preserve, and economic pain more concentrated than theoretical models suggest. Finally, facing political pressure from affected industries and regions, policies are modified, delayed, or abandoned, often leaving lasting damage to trade relationships without achieving the original objectives. Do you see a pattern here or isolated failures? Let us know. The immediate consequence was not a formal trade war. It was operational risk. Manufacturing associations warned of potential layoffs if uncertainty persisted. Industry groups representing sectors from automotive parts to electrical equipment issued statements emphasizing that their members could not operate efficiently without clarity on trade policy. Human resources departments began preparing contingency plans for workforce reductions, not because orders had declined, but because the unpredictability made it impossible to commit to production schedules or accept new contracts with confidence. Workers faced the prospect of losing jobs not due to lack of demand or foreign competition, but simply because their employers could not navigate the fog of policy uncertainty. Energy analysts told Reuters that even perceived instability in cross-border flows introduces price volatility. The integrated North American energy market depends on predictable transmission of electricity, natural gas, and petroleum products across borders. Canadian hydroelectric power flows to U.S. markets. American natural gas supplies Canadian facilities. Refined petroleum products move in both directions based on seasonal demand and refining capacity. When traders and utilities began factoring in the possibility of disrupted flows or new costs, futures markets responded with increased volatility. This uncertainty translated directly into higher hedging costs and ultimately into consumer energy bills, even though no actual policy change had occurred. Construction firms flagged contract delays and penalty exposure tied to late materials. Major infrastructure projects operate on carefully sequenced timelines where delays cascade through entire schedules. Canadian lumber, steel components, and specialized building materials form essential inputs for projects across the United States. Construction companies working under fixed-price contracts found themselves facing the possibility of cost overruns they could not pass on to clients, or delivery failures that would trigger penalty clauses. Some firms began adding risk premiums to bids for new projects, making infrastructure development more expensive. Others simply postponed projects entirely until the policy environment stabilized. Longer term, experts interviewed by the Financial Times warned of something more damaging: companies redesigning supply chains to reduce political exposure, even at higher cost. Once those decisions are made, they rarely reverse. Corporate strategists explained that while efficiency and cost optimization typically drive supply chain design, reliability and predictability ultimately matter more. A supply chain that is 5% cheaper but subject to sudden political disruption represents a greater risk than one that costs slightly more but operates in a stable regulatory environment. Companies began exploring options to source materials domestically at higher prices, develop alternative suppliers in different countries, or relocate production entirely to reduce cross-border dependencies. These strategic shifts require substantial capital investment in new facilities, equipment, and supplier relationships. Once a company commits hundreds of millions of dollars to a new supply chain configuration, reversing that decision becomes economically irrational even if the original threat disappears. This is not about winning a news cycle. It is about credibility, reliability, and whether partners believe integration with the U.S. is safe. Trade relationships, like any relationships, depend fundamentally on trust. Other countries and foreign investors must believe that the United States will honor its agreements, apply rules consistently, and refrain from using its market power as a tool of arbitrary coercion. When that trust erodes, the consequences extend far beyond any single dispute or industry sector. Countries begin hedging against American unpredictability by diversifying their trade relationships, even when doing so reduces economic efficiency. Investors factor political risk into their calculations when considering American ventures. Allied nations question whether economic integration with the United States represents a strategic asset or a vulnerability. Stay with us because the broader implications extend far beyond Canada. Power in an integrated economy is not about size. It is about trust. Trade leverage that disrupts your own production base is not strength. It is self-harm. The fundamental miscalculation in aggressive trade posturing lies in the assumption that economic size alone confers negotiating advantage. In reality, deeply integrated economies create mutual dependencies that cannot be severed without damage to both parties. When the United States threatens tariffs on Canadian imports, it simultaneously threatens American manufacturers who depend on those inputs, American workers whose jobs rely on cross-border supply chains, and American consumers who benefit from efficient North American production networks. The leverage cuts both ways, but the damage is not equally distributed. It concentrates in specific communities, industries, and workforces that have built their livelihoods around the promise of stable trade relationships. As legal and economic analysts have repeatedly noted, reliability is the currency of global markets. When it is questioned, capital and supply chains quietly move elsewhere. International business decisions increasingly incorporate policy risk as a measurable variable alongside traditional factors like labor costs, transportation infrastructure, and market access. Countries that demonstrate consistent adherence to trade rules and predictable policy frameworks attract investment even when they cannot offer the lowest costs or largest markets. Conversely, unpredictability creates a discount that compounds over time. Chief financial officers and corporate strategists do not announce these shifts with press releases. They simply adjust their models, redirect capital flows, and gradually reconfigure operations to reduce exposure to unreliable partners. By the time the pattern becomes visible in aggregate data, the damage has already been done. Canada's response, measured and rule-based, exposed a vulnerability that had always existed. An economy optimized for efficiency cannot absorb political shock without real human cost. Canadian officials demonstrated that adherence to established trade frameworks, even in the face of pressure from a larger trading partner, represents a form of strength that aggressive posturing cannot match. By refusing to accept demands for below-market pricing while simultaneously emphasizing their commitment to USMCA rules and dispute resolution mechanisms, Canadian negotiators highlighted the contrast between rules-based order and transactional coercion. This approach resonated with other trading partners watching the dispute and wondering about their own vulnerability to similar pressure. The vulnerability Canada's response revealed was not Canadian weakness but American dependence on the very integration that aggressive trade policy threatened to unravel. Decades of supply chain optimization had created extraordinarily efficient production systems, but efficiency came at the cost of resilience. Manufacturing facilities located near the Canadian border because proximity reduced transportation costs and enabled just-in-time delivery. Industries structured themselves around the assumption that components and materials would flow freely across the border. Workers developed specialized skills tailored to these integrated production processes. When political decisions suddenly called that integration into question, there was no reserve capacity, no alternative suppliers standing ready, no quick pivot that could maintain production without disruption. Workers feel it first. Communities pay for it longest. When a manufacturing plant reduces shifts or announces layoffs due to supply chain uncertainty, individual workers and their families experience immediate financial stress. Mortgage payments, car loans, and household budgets built on the assumption of steady employment suddenly become untenable. But the community-level impacts extend far beyond those direct job losses. Local businesses that depend on workers' spending see reduced revenue. Property values decline as economic uncertainty makes communities less attractive. Tax bases shrink, forcing difficult choices about schools, infrastructure, and public services. Young people leave to seek opportunities elsewhere. The social fabric that holds communities together frays under economic pressure. These communities often invested heavily based on promises of economic integration and free trade. Towns built infrastructure to support manufacturing facilities. Workers pursued training and education tailored to specific industries. Local governments offered tax incentives and regulatory accommodations to attract and retain employers. When trade policy shifts undermine the foundations of these investments, the costs cannot be quickly recovered or easily redirected. A closed factory might eventually reopen under different ownership or for a different purpose, but the workers who lost years of seniority and the families who exhausted savings during unemployment never fully recover what was lost. If you value calm, fact-driven breakdowns that explain what headlines leave out, subscribe to the channel. And if this issue affects your industry or community, share your experience below.